On May 23, 1940, tanks from Heinz Guderian's 1st Panzer Division reached the Aa Canal, roughly 12 miles from the port of Dunkirk. Standing on a hill, Guderian could see the town walls. His engineers had already thrown pontoon bridges across the canal. There was almost nothing between his panzers and the last port the British could use to escape. And then an order came down telling him to stop. For the next 2 days, some of the best tank crews in the world sat in their vehicles and watched as over 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated right under their noses. So today, we're telling you the full story of how the German Panzers drove 240 kilometers in 8 days, reached the edge of the greatest military prize of the war, and then were told to park. Why it happened, who was really responsible, and what those 2 days cost Germany for the rest of the war. To understand why the halt order was so devastating, you first have to understand how fast the German Panzers had been moving and what that speed had already cost them. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. The entire plan hinged on a deception. Army Group B attacked into Belgium and the Netherlands, making noise, drawing attention, pulling the best Allied armies north to meet them. Meanwhile, the real blow came through the Ardennes forest in southern Belgium and Luxembourg, where 7 of Germany's 10 Panzer divisions were concentrated in Army Group A. The Allies thought the Ardennes was impassable for armour. Dense forest, narrow roads, steep terrain. The French believed it would take at least 4 days just to reach the Meuse River, and even then, the river crossing would buy them time to bring up reserves. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps reached the Meuse at Sedan on the evening of May 12th, 2 days into the invasion, and reported no sign of the enemy on the far bank. The French 4-day estimate was already wrong. On May 13th, Guderian forced a crossing of the Meuse under massive Stuka support. French defenders, almost completely lacking anti-aircraft guns in that sector, broke under the dive bombing before the tanks even crossed. Engineers threw bridges across the river, and by the 14th, armour was pouring through the gap. The French tried to counterattack, but by the time their reserves arrived, the bridgehead was already too deep to collapse. And here's where it gets interesting. Guderian's superiors wanted him to consolidate the bridgehead and wait for the infantry to catch up. Guderian didn't wait. He described his continued advance as reconnaissance in force, which was basically his way of saying he was going to keep driving west and deal with the consequences later. On May 17th, he crossed the Oise River. On May 19th, he reached Amiens. On May 20th, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division reached Abbeville at the mouth of the Somme, and the Panzer Corridor had reached the English Channel. In 10 days, the Panzers had driven roughly 240 kilometers from the German border to the sea. The entire Allied army was now cut in two. Everything north of that corridor, the BEF, the French First Army, the Belgian Army, was trapped. And Guderian immediately turned north toward the Channel ports, Boulogne, Calais, and then Dunkirk, the last port the Allies could use to get out. Now, the popular image of the 1940 Panzer Force is a wall of heavy tanks smashing through everything in front of them. The reality was very different. Germany committed roughly 2,636 tanks to the campaign on May 10th. But the majority of those tanks were Panzer Is and Panzer IIs, light tanks that were already considered obsolete. The Panzer I carried nothing but 2 machine guns. The Panzer II had a 20mm cannon. Against Allied tanks equipped with guns of 37mm and above, they were outgunned. The heavier Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, the tanks that could actually fight other armour, were available in relatively small numbers. 3 of the 10 Panzer divisions were actually equipped with captured Czech tanks, the Panzer 35T and 38T, which were decent designs, but still light vehicles with 37mm guns. What made the Panzers effective wasn't the hardware. It was concentration, radio communication, combined arms coordination, and speed. Every German tank had a functioning radio. Most Allied tanks did not. German tank commanders could coordinate their movements in real time, while French tankers were still relying on flags and hand signals. And the Panzer divisions weren't just tanks. They were self-contained fighting formations with motorized infantry, artillery, engineers, and anti-tank guns, all moving together at the same speed. But 2 weeks of continuous advance had ground those formations down hard. Tanks break. They throw tracks, overheat engines, strip gears, burn through transmissions on bad roads. Even the best tanks of the era, vehicles like the T-34 or the Sherman, routinely lost 20% of their strength to mechanical breakdowns on extended cross-country operations. And the German light tanks were not the best tanks of the era. By May 23rd, Kleist reported to Army Group A that his Panzer Group had lost 50% of its tanks since the start of the campaign. Hoth's 15th Panzer Corps was down by roughly a third. Now, tank commanders like General Nering pointed out that many of those losses were vehicles disabled by minor faults, things that could be repaired in hours if the crews got a chance to stop and work on them. But Hitler and the higher command couldn't understand that distinction. They saw 50% losses and panicked, and there was a deeper problem. Total German tank losses for the entire 6-week campaign in France came to 839 vehicles destroyed beyond recovery, out of roughly 2,900 committed. That's nearly a third of the starting force. The campaign that everyone remembers as a walkover was actually chewing through tanks at a rate that made the High Command very nervous about what would come next, because France wasn't finished yet. The entire southern half of the country still had to be conquered, and if the Panzer Divisions burned out their remaining tanks taking Dunkirk, what would they have left for the drive on Paris? And then something happened on May 21st that sent a shockwave through the entire German command structure, completely out of proportion to what actually occurred on the ground. The British launched a counterattack at Arras. The force was small. The 1st Army Tank Brigade had 58 Mark I Matilda tanks armed with nothing but machine guns, and 16 of the heavier Mark II Matildas with 40mm guns. 2 infantry battalions supported them. A French light mechanized division joined on the right flank with about 60 Saumur tanks. That was it. Roughly 74 to 88 tanks and a few thousand infantry. They hit Rommel's 7th Panzer Division and the SS Totenkopf Division, and for a few hours things got genuinely ugly for the Germans. The Matilda IIs were slow, but their armour was thick enough that German 37mm anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate them. One Matilda took 14 hits and kept going. German anti-tank rounds bounced off the front plates. The British tanks rolled over gun positions, crushed equipment, and broke into German supply columns. The SS Totenkopf troops, who had barely seen combat, panicked and ran. Rommel personally took charge, rallying his men and directing artillery and 88mm anti-aircraft guns against the British tanks. By evening, the counterattack had been repulsed. The British lost 60 of their 88 tanks. On the ground, it was a tactical failure, but the psychological effect was enormous. Rommel reported to higher command that he'd been attacked by 5 enemy divisions. It was actually 2 tank regiments and 2 infantry brigades. That report rocketed up the chain of command. The 19th Panzer Corps War Diary recorded that the counterattack created nervousness throughout the entire Kleist Group area. Kleist himself became reluctant to advance further until the situation at Arras was resolved. Kluge, commanding 4th Army, wanted to halt all forward movement, and Rundstedt, commanding Army Group A, saw the entire situation as proof that the Panzers had gotten too far ahead of their supporting infantry. What made this so damaging was that the German High Command had been afraid of exactly this kind of counterattack since the breakthrough at Sedan. They had just cut the Allied army in half with a corridor that was hundreds of kilometers long and, in some places, dangerously thin. Every general above the Panzer commanders was waiting for the Allies to hit that corridor from both sides and cut the spearheads off. The Arras counterattack, small as it was, confirmed their worst fear. And it didn't matter that the fear was out of proportion to the reality. What mattered was that the men making decisions believed it. On the evening of May 23rd, with the 1st Panzer Division sitting on the Aa Canal roughly 12 miles from Dunkirk and engineers already bridging the canal, Kluge phoned Rundstedt at Army Group A headquarters in Charleville. Kluge, an old-school artilleryman, told Rundstedt that the tanks had gotten too far ahead and that the troops would welcome an opportunity to close up. Rundstedt agreed, and word went down the line. The Panzers would pause on the 24th. At this point, nobody treated it as anything more than a temporary measure, a chance to catch their breath. Then, on the morning of May 24th, Hitler flew to Rundstedt's headquarters. And this is where the temporary pause became something much worse. Rundstedt advised that the infantry should attack the British at Arras, where the British had proven capable of launching significant operations, while Kleist's armour held a line west and south of Dunkirk. The terrain around Dunkirk was waterlogged, canal-crossed, and generally bad tank country. Hitler, who had served as an infantryman in Flanders during the First World War, knew that terrain personally. He agreed with Rundstedt. The order came down that afternoon. German forces were not to cross the canal line running from La Bassée through Bethune, Saint-Omer, and Gravelines, roughly 10 miles west of Dunkirk. The destruction of the trapped Allied forces would be left to the Luftwaffe and to the infantry of Army Group B, pushing from the east. Guderian was speechless. He had bridges across the canal. He could see Dunkirk. There was almost nothing in front of him, and he was being told to stop and let Göring's bombers do the job. Franz Halder, the chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary that the orders from the top made no sense. The day before, he had written that Hitler was terribly nervous, frightened by his own success, afraid to take any chance, and would rather pull the reins. The halt order stayed in effect for roughly 2 days. On the afternoon of May 26th, Hitler finally allowed the panzers to resume, but most units took another 16 hours to actually get moving. By then, the Allies had flooded the low-lying ground around Dunkirk, established a defensive perimeter, and Operation Dynamo, the evacuation, was already underway. After the war, every German general with access to a publisher blamed Hitler for the halt order and presented it as proof of his military incompetence. The reality, as is usually the case, was messier. There were at least 5 factors working at the same time, and nobody has ever fully agreed on which one mattered most. First, Rundstedt's caution. This is often overlooked because the post-war memoirs pinned everything on Hitler. But Rundstedt initiated the halt before Hitler confirmed it. He was a traditional Prussian staff officer who had watched his Panzer spearheads race ahead of their infantry for 2 weeks, and he was convinced the flanks were dangerously exposed. The Arras counterattack reinforced that fear. Rundstedt wanted to consolidate, bring up the infantry, and reduce the pocket methodically. He recommended the halt. Hitler agreed with him. Both men were later very creative about rewriting their roles in their memoirs. Second, Göring's promise. On May 23rd, Göring phoned Hitler and demanded that his Luftwaffe be given primary responsibility for destroying the Allied forces trapped around Dunkirk. There was politics in this. The Luftwaffe was considered a Nazi party instrument because of Göring's political status. Giving the Air Force the kill would be a political win for Göring and for the party over the traditional army. Hitler was reportedly non-committal on the phone, but the idea clearly influenced his thinking the next day. Third, terrain. The ground around Dunkirk is flat, waterlogged, and crossed by canals and drainage ditches. It was bad country for tanks, even before the Allies opened sluice gates and flooded large areas deliberately. Guderian himself admitted this after the fact. On May 28th, after heavy rain, he told Kleist's chief of staff that a tank attack in such marshy ground was pointless, and that infantry was better suited for that country. He even noted that his tanks were suffering unnecessary casualties, so the terrain argument wasn't entirely wrong, even if the timing of the halt was. Fourth, preserving armour for the second phase. France was only half conquered. The entire southern half of the country, including Paris, still had to be taken. If the Panzer Divisions burned out their remaining tanks, grinding through canal-crossed marshland around Dunkirk, they might not have enough left for the drive south. This was a legitimate operational concern. The German High Command was already planning Fall Rot, the second phase of the French campaign, and they needed those tanks. And fifth, the diplomatic theory. This is the most debated one. Some accounts quote Hitler as saying he deliberately let the British escape because he believed a peace deal with Britain was still possible, and that humiliating the British army would make negotiations harder. Hitler supposedly told a close associate that the blood of every single Englishman was too valuable to shed. Whether he actually believed this or was just rationalizing the decision after the fact, nobody knows. But it's worth noting that on the same day as the halt order, Hitler's Directive No. 13 explicitly called for the annihilation of the trapped Allied forces. So if he was trying to let the British go, His own orders said otherwise. The honest answer is that it was probably all 5 at once, in varying degrees, with Rundstedt's caution and the mechanical state of the Panzers providing the practical justification, Göring's ambition providing the political pressure, and Hitler's own nervousness tying it all together. The men who could have taken Dunkirk, Guderian, and his tank crews were the ones with the least say in the decision. When the halt was finally lifted on May 26th, it was already too late. The Allies had used those 2 days exactly the way the Panzer commanders feared they would. The defensive perimeter around Dunkirk was established, the canal system was flooded, and the evacuation was beginning. The Luftwaffe tried to do what Göring had promised, but the weather over the Channel was poor for much of the evacuation period, grounding aircraft on several critical days. When the bombers did get through, RAF Fighter Command met them over the beaches. The Luftwaffe couldn't stop the evacuation. It couldn't even slow it down enough to matter. Between May 26th and June 4th, over 338,000 Allied soldiers were pulled off the beaches and out of the harbour, roughly 198,000 British and 140,000 French and Belgian troops. They left behind virtually all their heavy equipment, vehicles and weapons, but the men got out. Guderian later called the failure to order a timely assault on Dunkirk one of the major German mistakes on the Western Front. He wasn't wrong. Those 338,000 men, especially the roughly 198,000 British soldiers, would form the core of the army that came back to Normandy 4 years later. The BEF lost 68,000 soldiers during the French campaign and had to abandon nearly everything it owned. But the trained men survived. And trained men are harder to replace than tanks. It's tempting to play the what-if game here, and with Dunkirk, the what-if is enormous. If the Panzers had continued on May 24th, with bridges already across the Aa Canal, minimal opposition ahead, and the Allied defensive perimeter not yet established, the odds of sealing the pocket before any large-scale evacuation could begin were high. Not certain, but high. Without those 338,000 men, Britain's ability to continue the war changes dramatically. Churchill said it himself. He called Dunkirk a colossal military disaster and warned that wars are not won by evacuations. But he also knew that the whole root and core and brain of the British Army had been at Dunkirk. If it had been captured, the pressure on Britain to negotiate would have been enormous, and the army that eventually came back to France on D-Day would have had to be built almost from scratch. Instead, Germany got the equipment, but not the men. About 40,000 French soldiers were captured when the perimeter finally fell on June 4th. The beaches were littered with abandoned vehicles, artillery pieces, and ammunition. But the soldiers who knew how to use them were already in England, and nobody on the German side, not Rundstedt, not Göring, and not Hitler, ever got back the 2 days they wasted arguing about whose job it was to finish the fight. Guderian considered the halt order one of the most disastrous decisions of the entire war. He spent the rest of his life saying so. 4 years later, the men who escaped through Dunkirk came back across the Channel and landed in Normandy. Guderian was right.